Good morning, everybody. Greetings from Berlin. My name is Reinhard Bütikofer, and I will be your host for this workshop this morning. Welcome to a great conversation that we're going to have around the external dimension of the European Green Deal. And I'm very proud to be able to present to you, together with my colleagues Hanna Neumann, Viola von Kramon, and Sergei Lagodinsky, three outstanding experts as your speakers this morning. I will introduce them a little bit more extensively before I give each of them the floor, but I want to say welcome very much to Jennifer Tolman from E3G, Michael Rademacher from the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and Mark Leonard from the European Council on Foreign Relations. I'm not going to waste too much time with introducing the topic. I guess you have a rough idea, at least, of what it would pertain to, because you've had enough interest to join the workshop. But I will make very few housekeeping remarks. We have two interpreters this morning, Karin Walker and Barbara Kagan, and they will interpret for you English and German. So if you want to make use of the interpretation, you can click on a little globe button that you find on your screen. Our presenters will each use some PowerPoint. If you're interested to receive that, you can let us know. After the workshop, we will share that with you. They have agreed to that. After the presentations, 15 minutes each, there will be the Q&A section of this workshop, which you can join actively by using the chat function. It would be good if you would concentrate on the chat function. You can ask your questions or make your remarks either in English or in German. We would read that then to the experts and get their answers. You might also use the Q&A function, but it would be better if we would have to monitor just one of the functions. And at the end, my colleagues, Hanna Neumann and Viola von Kramon, will give summing up remarks. I think that's all I have to say now. So let me turn to our first expert this morning, Jennifer Tolman. Welcome again. You are a senior policy advisor at E3G. You're based in Berlin. You're part of E3G's climate diplomacy and geopolitical team. You lead their work on EU climate diplomacy, and you co-authored a study last year on climate superpowers, analyzing climate policy of China and of the EU. And I want to give you the floor first for 15 minutes. Please, Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be discussing this today. I feel we need more discussion on the external dimensions of the Green Deal. Now, in the hopes that this is showing up in presentation mode and not in presenter mode, I'm not seeing confused faces, so I'm guessing that that is the case. I really want to talk to you guys today, not about next generation EU, but what next generation EU climate and energy diplomacy needs to look like, or could look like, depending on how proactive, how geopolitical the EU wants to be. Now, climate diplomacy is very much lived in a space that has been growing, but that has been very much about addressing climate as an existential threat. But the EU's decision to put the Green Deal as not just an environmental policy, but as very much a driver for growth, as a growth strategy, means that there also needs to be a step change in the EU's approach to foreign policy, because you can't put climate at the center of your economics and not also put it at the center of your foreign policy, at least not medium term, if you want that to succeed. Therefore, I feel that this move has added two potential layers to what we consider climate, or kind of climate-centered foreign policy. One big one is looking at how we bring partners and markets along. So really just looking at what do we need to make the Green Deal succeed at home, and what does that require cooperation-wise abroad. But then seeing as we are now at a time when the EU is very much wanting to shape international conversations, wanting to be a geopolitical actor that doesn't get caught between major power politics between the US and China, there is an additional layer that isn't just this bringing partners and markets along, which is very much the geopolitical Green Deal diplomacy, and seeing whether we can use the Green Deal and our regulatory progress and frontierism here to position the EU as a global rules and market shaper, somebody who has an automatic seat at the table because of our know-how and our ability to manage this transition. Now, going into a bit more detail on what each of these kind of slightly esoteric terms actually could look like, I think climate diplomacy is probably the thing that most people think of when they start thinking about the external dimensions of the Green Deal. This is the stuff that we would be doing even if there wasn't a Green Deal in place, because we see climate as a shared existential threat. And that is issues around engaging all major emitters on accelerating their decarbonization, on accelerating their transition to a cleaner economy, with this year obviously being very important for getting as many major economies, as many non-EU G20 countries to shift significantly their ambition for the next decade, their pathways for the next decade, and also really looking at shutting down those international coal pipelines and the funding for those international coal pipelines. But it also means maintaining trust in the multilateral approach to climate change. So that means really also maintaining the trust of those countries who aren't automatically in the G20, who aren't in a major economies forum, but who face very much the front line of that existential threat of climate change. So this is delivering on those solidarity commitments to developing country partners, delivering the support, both financial but also technical, to make sure that they can deal with the climate impacts and to support them in their own transition so that their development pathways are a lot cleaner than ours have been. On the more climate security side of things, which I won't go into too much because I'm hoping we will hear more about it later on, there is an interest and to a certain extent a moral imperative to support in tackling and navigating climate-related security risks, particularly in our immediate neighborhood. So that means investing in early warning, adaptation and management of climate-related risks and disasters. And then obviously there's the more techie governance side of this, which is about the transparency and the environmental integrity of international rules that actually allow us to track and monitor where we are globally. Now, this is already a lot, but that is very much the heart of what traditional climate diplomacy has been. And it's a heart that we need to maintain because it is the basis on which we build internationally. It is the room that we step into. And it's our standing in that room as we step into it. But beyond this baseline, there are two other options now that we have very much made climate central to our economic growth and to our development pathway as an EU. The first one is very much about looking at how we center climate in the EU's energy, development, and neighborhood diplomacy. This is about bringing our markets, bringing our partners, bringing our neighborhood along in all of this, and also helping to manage any of the risks that might happen, geopolitically speaking, from our wish to transition, as important and as necessary as it is. So what this actually looks like is in investing in climate neutrality pathways, investing in the connectivity and the energy infrastructure, particularly in the EU neighborhood, that will support our own transition and support those countries' transition at the same time. So this is very much looking at the MENA region, looking at the Eastern Partnership, looking at the Western Balkans. What is our strategy there? How are we accelerating those transitions, as well as in key supplier countries for some of the green markets that we're hoping to build? The second one is high ambition alliances. So not just in terms of governance structures, but also in terms of clean tech innovation. Now, this is something that was very prominent in the proposed transatlantic agenda for global cooperation with the US, and something that I think is very much worth exploring. How do we accelerate that pre-competitive innovation space so that we just get technologies to market so much faster? The third one, which I'm very happy to see initial steps on, but certainly a lot more needs to be done on, is a coherent EU energy transition diplomacy, particularly for engaging fossil fuel producers. So acknowledging that there will be countries that risk losing quite significantly from this transition globally, and engaging them not only kind of through being very transparent about our future demand and having the honesty to talk about what that means for our relationships with countries like Russia, but also for supplier countries in the immediate neighborhood. But also through supporting transition planning, economic diversification, and particularly orderly and just transitions. And then a final one, which is obviously very front of mind this year, is diplomatic engagement around managing risks. And I think one to note here is definitely carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Now, if you're in this external dimensions of the Green Deal space, you will have definitely heard about this. But essentially, the carbon border adjustment mechanism concept has been a really helpful tool for engaging major economies by saying, look, we are going to start considering trade consequences for climate inaction. But when you look at the brass tacks of it, there are some risks to be managed, particularly in the immediate neighborhood. And just to kind of illustrate that up a bit, it wouldn't necessarily affect who you think it would affect. And I think this is not just about the carbon border adjustment mechanisms principle as such, it's about the Green Deal policies. Do we need diplomatic impact assessments of Green Deal policies that really affect neighborhood countries? Because if you look at this, if we have a carbon border adjustment mechanism that would be imposed on iron and steel or on cement, I don't think it's Ukraine that we were planning on targeting with this, or necessarily Colombia. So really thinking through not just our internal impact assessments, but our external impact assessments, I think will be really key for risk managing this incredibly necessary transition. Now, the final dimension, which is really ours to take if we want it, but would require a lot more proactive coordination and kind of investment in this area than we have seen in the past, and also adding a lot more teeth than we have seen in the past to EU external diplomacy, is this idea of geopolitical EU as regulatory EU. So really the EU is a global shaper of markets and a global shaper of rules. And what this actually means is looking at where we really have the right regulatory baseline and credibility and environmental integrity to shape the rules of this emerging global clean economy. We're talking about a major reset of sectors and markets across the world over the next 30 years. Who will be shaping the rules under which those competitions happening? We think it could be the EU. Because we are a first mover in a lot of this regulatory space. Now, the most immediate example of this that springs to mind is shaping the international norms of what is considered green or sustainable investment. The EU's sustainable finance regulation has the opportunity to be world leading, to be a gold standard, depending on how we preserve the environmental integrity of what we're defining as green. And ensuring that there aren't fragmentations between major financial markets on what is and isn't considered green, and engaging countries like the US that has now taken this topic up in the G20, like China that has been doing a lot of work on this, through active regulatory diplomacy is an area where we can really establish our rules as the baseline and our rules as the global standards. A second one here is very much about how we look at climate and trade, and not just trade agreements, but bilateral economic strategies and relations. So how do we support cooperative kind of multilateral approaches to green standards and product requirements? It doesn't sound sexy, but it is incredibly important for deciding how we compete in these green markets and how our industries can compete here, and how much control we have over it or not. Very similarly to that, there is a real opportunity to shape economic rules as the COVID crisis has really flagged up that resilience is missing in economic systems, and economic systems are no longer fit for purpose. Fundamental economic rules are coming under review in the G7, in the G20, but also in spaces like development finance, multilateral development banks. Now, the EU member states actually hold leadership in both the G20 and the G7 over the next 2 years, with Italy obviously chairing the G20 this year, and Germany leading the G7 next year. This is a real possibility to drive a European aligned approach through key member states, as well as leveraging European shareholdership, which is immense, in multilateral development banks to make sure that our development finance flows into resilience, flows not just into climate resilience, but health resilience, societal resilience, but doesn't go into maladaptation, doesn't go into not clean development pathways that we will then have to fix, or we will then be confronted with the climate inaction down the line. And then the final one, which is a lot more of a future focused piece, is grasping the climate and digital intersection. Now, one of the biggest risks of fragmentation over the next 20 years is in digital systems, because there are fundamental disagreements about the governance and the privacy systems for digital governance. But we frequently forget that the future of climate action needs to be digital as well. So looking at what actually the systems are that drive smart grids, what actually the systems are that drive the Internet of Things, that's going to be really key, and grasping the diplomacy of that proactively is going to be a huge part for protecting not just European green markets, but European citizens' digital privacy and digital safety. Now, I've thrown a lot at you here, but the good news is when you start talking tacheles, as we say here in Germany, when you start talking brass tacks, there's actually a lot that EU foreign ministers agreed to do that we actually now just need to start delivering. And here I'm referring to the slightly geeky, but actually quite impressive Foreign Affairs Council conclusions from January on climate and energy diplomacy, which actually held a lot of these first steps for the practice rather than the theory of this next generation of EU climate and energy diplomacy. Now, what did they actually agree to do? They agreed to champion clean energy transition, climate, and green recovery agendas in all international fora. That was a commitment made, and a commitment that is very much going to be looked at and seen how we've done that. There was a commitment to refocus EU energy diplomacy on accelerating decarbonization, so to shift the primary goal of energy diplomacy to decarbonization rather than primarily energy security, including a commitment to an energy diplomacy action plan by the end of the year. Now, as part of this energy diplomacy section, there was actually a quite strong call for an immediate end to all international finance for new coal infrastructure in third countries, as well as a phasing out of unabated coal and energy production also in those third countries, and a commitment to take first steps towards phasing out all international finance for fossil fuels, at least from the public sector, so that no more tax money was going into building development pathways that are no longer sustainable. To back that up, there was an interest in supporting the development and delivery of just transition initiatives. Now, this may sound really geeky and very climate insidery for now, but it's actually a space to start building credible alternatives to Russian and Chinese investments with geopolitical strings attached into the EU neighborhood, into African countries, into the areas that we have a geostrategic interest into, but we haven't really grasped it as such. But what are the cleaner, more resilient, more sustainable alternatives that we are offering? And could this be the space to start building them? There was also an agreement to have high ambition, high level alliances with a strong focus on non-EU G20 members for really accelerating that transition and innovation. There was a commitment to leverage EU sustainable finance regulations internationally. And there was a kind of more long-term commitment to align all EU trade agreements, development finance and foreign investment strategies with domestic climate pledges in the Paris Agreement, as well as engaging with international financial institutions, so particularly these multilateral development banks that channel so much money to do the same. Now, that is a really decent list to get started on in 2021, but it's very much about making sure that actually happens and it doesn't feel like the buck stops with these Foreign Affairs Council conclusions. Now, the good news is there are a ton of opportunities to do this, but it requires really coordinated diplomacy. Now, this is a bit of a complex slide, but the thing that I really want people to notice is how much blue there is on here. These are European-driven or EU member state-led or convened spaces, and this is by no means a comprehensive calendar. It's just a bit of a highlight. We have space where we have global stages, or where we're even organizing global stages where a lot of this could start to be delivered. But we're not necessarily seeing the coordination between the EU and member states to actually deliver it, despite the fact that there is a baseline agreement to do so. Now, very concretely, as I am running out of time, and I'm very happy to have been invited by the European Parliament Greens to discuss this, this is where the European Parliament could make an immediate difference to the external projection of the Green Deal. I think one is really being the actor that establishes clarity on timelines, responsibility, and progress reports of the delivery of these Foreign Affairs Council conclusions that are really promising, but aren't being followed up on in a comprehensive way. I think there's also a real need for a state of European external or rather international fossil finance review. How far do we actually have to go? How far do member states have to go? And who is still financing what? Hearing reports of kind of some German external financing going into the infrastructure investments around Chinese coal financing, I feel like we're doing something wrong here. And I feel like even just getting a state of the picture is going to be really key.
Two-minute warning.
Thank you very
Jennifer.
much. There are some risk management pieces that I think the European Parliament could be really key to supporting in terms of this diplomatic impact assessment of CBAM proposals. What actually, can we request that? Is that something that we need to start instituting as the Green Deal starts shaping not just our markets, but markets abroad? And also very much, I know this is already happening, but very much defending the EU sustainable finance taxonomy that has this opportunity to be the international gold standard, making sure that we're not the continent that labels gas as green or gas as sustainable when it is in fact a transition fuel that has very concrete and very limited investment needs if you look at the global climate transition. So really making sure that we are setting ourselves up for that geopolitical leadership in terms of rule shaping by being incredibly credible, by being the actor that not just champions environmental integrity in UN climate negotiations in word, but champions environmental integrity in act in the way that we regulate and we define our own transparency mechanisms, which is what the taxonomy is at the end of the day. I think there is also options around the review of development and neighbourhood programming and spending, particularly as we start looking at this new pot of money, the Neighbourhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument. How do we make that fit for 55%? Are we looking at the investments that we need in the neighbourhood to support our own energy transition, to support grid interconnection, to support this new hydrogen economy that we're meant to be building? And then the final two is keep building high ambition alliances and really championing coherent energy transition diplomacy via the European Parliament's own delegations with key countries, its own engagement with key countries, and keep setting the bar high for climate ambition as it has done on COP resolutions and climate resolutions over the past couple of years. I will leave you with that, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Jennifer Tolman. And we immediately move on to our next expert, Michel Gadimaka from the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, where he is the Deputy Director. He works particularly on international multi-stakeholder projects, also on new and upcoming strategic security and geopolitical topics like raw materials. He's been serving in the Royal Netherlands Army for 15 years, and he helped publishing a climate security risk index last year. And we would like to hear more about that. Welcome, Michel Gadimaka. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Reinhard. Pleasure to be here and have the floor a couple of minutes. I'll try to stick within the 15 minutes. As agreed, my PowerPoint would be shared by Katrina. Thank you. So, yeah, what I'd like to do is to take you on a little journey of how to measure climate security risks, basically, and why is this so important? Within the International Military Council on Climate Security, which at the moment already represents some 34 countries, we concluded actually that the scope of what climate change requires or entails towards some mitigating insecurities is something of a special attention for us. And what we did in this report, and I just shared the link to both the report and the IMCCS, is that we try to make it possible to measure climate insecurity. So next sheet, please. Yeah, so I'll shortly we'll introduce a little bit further what it is about, some background, a little bit of terms and definitions, conceptual framework, and then of course, the results in what we would call a risk matrix, and we have some nice plots, I think, that we can make out of this as well. So next sheet, please. Yeah, so the idea is that we, as a start for the analysis, have a methodology which, on the one hand, takes climate change as a start, then have climate-related events as a trigger, and what we call climate hazards. And it's not all hazards, but only those that we think have a direct climate change effect. So we do not take tsunamis or earthquakes into account so much, because they were there for always and not specifically triggered by climate change. But the others we do. So like flooding, storms, landslides, heat waves, droughts, and wildfires are the most important ones. And then, of course, we try to capture what kind of risk factors there are there, and then, of course, what are the drivers for insecurity. And I'll come back to that later a bit more. The idea behind this this kind of scheme is then when we are able to underpin each and every aspect with indicators that show what is there, and we are able to fill them with data, then we can really measure things. And that's what we did. It's quite extensive work. If you would look at the report, you'll find some 70, 80 pages, of which most of it's appendices that explain all the indicators and where they're found. And we use World Bank, IMF, and all kind of others. It's really heavy stuff in that sense. Next sheet, please. So yeah, what is climate security? Basically, it is the effects that climate change have on, for example, people, on critical resources and infrastructure, forcing masses of groups of people in unwanted migration, political instability, or state and interstate violence and conflict. So. But of course, climate hazards as such do not directly produce interstate violence or conflict, but they often are a threat multiplier and are an underlying driver for instability and insecurity. So by understanding this very well, we could at some point in the future maybe also better predict where instabilities in the world would start, actually. We are now still often confronted with outbursts instead of already predicting where it might be and then be able to mitigate them in front. Next sheet, please. So yeah, we talk about climate hazards. I made just a couple of pictures of these. Coastal riverine flooding is taken into account, storms, wildfires, droughts and heat waves, and landslides. And these are, at first we thought it would be difficult to measure their impact, but in the end, I think we were capable of doing that. And we did it in the way that is being shown in the next sheet, the number 6. If you please could show that, indeed. So what we try to do is to make a breakdown of climate security risk elements. So you have on the one hand your probability, of course, and that still would mean nothing if you are really capable of handling those climate insecurities. So, but the potential impact is another main issue here. So you have probability and potential impact, and then within those two aspects, we made a breakdown. So we have the hazards I already told you about. And then, of course, we have the element of vulnerability. And vulnerability itself, of course, has a breakdown into two aspects. That's basically a lack of coping capacity and or a lack of adaptive capacity. The quality of what you can handle without going in crisis, so to say. I always take the Netherlands as an example. I'm now talking from my home in Leiden at the Dutch coast, the North Sea coast, and my house is 1.8 meter below sea level, and I really feel comfortable. So that in the Netherlands we are able to cope with it, and we have the adaptive capacity when even the sea levels would rise, because we are currently spending $1 billion a year to hiring dikes, make dunes more strong, etc., etc. So that is the vulnerability part. And then the potential impact is, on the one hand, is the exposure. To what extent is a certain country exposed to a climate hazard? If you're talking about the Alps, you don't need to worry too much about coastal flooding. You might have to worry about riverine flooding. So exposure is one, and then susceptibilities is the other one. So these elements we broke down into all kind of different indicators. So next sheet, please. So this is then how it looks like. So you got these 4 segments and all kind of details on all these indicators, and I won't bother you too much with all of them. But so just to know that all these kind of elements are taken into account. And then next sheet, number 8, I just made a snapshot of a part of it, so you can see what kind of indicators were taken into account. So early warning, healthcare, wash, food security, and all kind of things. I think all in all, some 40 plus indicators. And you see, of course, the sources. So it's World Bank in this case, FAO, and others. And we try to find as much as possible, as recent as possible data sets. And of course, what is a troublesome to some extent is that not all countries in the world have systems in place to really capture those kind of data. So that means in all for us, that at this point we were able to do an analysis on 140 countries worldwide. So we still miss out some 70, and for some we know, of course, that those are the most vulnerable to climate change. Anyway, this is a limitation for the time being. So this is part of vulnerability. Next sheet, please. So if you combine all this, now it's possible then for each and every climate hazard to make what we would call a risk plot. This is a scatter plot, so to say, and that means that the more to the right and the higher on the impact ladder, the more climate risky a country is. So India, in this case, scores major high, as an example. And so this is possible for all the 140 countries that we have measured, so to say. And the colors reflect different regions. So this is one way to show it. The next sheet, please. Is also that we can make it possible to make what we would call world heat maps. And then a thing is, of course, is that not for all hazards, of course, it's the same. So what you often see is that the arch of vulnerability, the stroke around, say, a northern part of Africa, is of course dealing with a lot of these climate change insecurities, but they differ, of course, per hazard. So we can produce this out of this monitor for both heat maps of the whole world, but there's also a possibility to do it differently. But sure, I think we still have a little bit of time. I will show you a couple of others. 11, please, the next sheet. This might be a little bit small, but the PowerPoint will be distributed. So we have them on riverine and on tropical storms. And here again, you see India right? China, but also the Philippines for tropical storms, etc. So this is one way of really trying to grasp what for a country or a set of countries is the most dangerous plot, so to say. So for policymakers, it's always important, I think, and that's the work that we at HSS do, to try to support our analysis with empirical data as much as possible. That's what we do with this monitor. Next sheet, please. So these are the heat maps, just to explain you again. And then there's another option. That's the next sheet already, and that's next sheet, please. Yes, this one. So this is another kind of combination. This is per country. So again, I took India, and now you can see for the different climate hazards how India scores. So 3 of them are a top 100 risk in that sense. So that's for heat waves, for example, and the others. So this is another way of showing it, and this is per country. Okay, so that leaves me for the next 2 minutes, 1 or 2 minutes, to some conclusions. So we were able to do what we would call a climate security risk score for approximately 140 countries. And it makes it possible now to have inferences with regard to hazards that threaten certain regions. Probability and potential impact scores are now possible, and to identify also climate-driven risks, and that's important. And I think this is as a starting point for actionable targets for climate policymakers, so to say. It is an important starting point. So what I'd like to do actually is to show you in the next sheet an overview that we used to try to gamify this question actually. So we did a tabletop exercise, but we now also have available a version online where we designed all kind of climate mitigation capabilities, so to say. So, and I just put them here as an example. And now it's possible with a small group when you're at the table, some 10 people, or when you're online, we can even play with a couple of hundred at the same time, to try to score with all those players which of these capabilities are the most important, either for preparation or response or aftercare, for example. We did that last 2 years already, and part of it can be found in the youngest World Climate Security Report of the International Military Council on Climate Security. And also at this year, we are having the online game open for participants from IMCCS for all the 34 countries. But if there's an option, Mr. Budikova, then it's maybe also possible to extend this to other audiences. The only thing that we need, and at that point, is their email address, because we have to grant them access to the game. But I think that's possible. Then my last sheet, maybe, and I know I'm now over time, half a minute, is
yeah, 1 minute warning. Yeah.
Yes, I had my timer on. So yeah, one of the constraints is that not all countries are there. Longer time series are required to do better predictions, actually. And we, at this point, only modeled the negative effects, but it might also be possible to have some others. Some of the wishes that we have to try to come to compounding risk and quantify them. So a country like India that has a couple of high scoring risks, we didn't compound them altogether, because that would even show higher vulnerabilities. This year, we'll also do some predictive modeling. And ideally, I would like to have this methodology as a web-based interactive monitor, so the rest of the world can take notes of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michel. And we immediately move on to our third expert. That is Mark Leonard, the co-founder and director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. His work specializes on geopolitical and geoeconomic issues, China, EU politics, and EU institutions. And last year, he co-authored a paper on the geopolitics of the European Green Deal. So welcome, Mark. You have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. I think you have to let me share my screen so that I can use my slides. It says it's disabled at the moment. Host disabled screen sharing.
Katrin will do that for you in a second.
Excellent.
You're now co-host, you can share it.
Fantastic, how exciting. Thank you very much. Hopefully you can see this. And what it's a huge pleasure to be here with you and you're with the group. And I think this is a really, really important discussion. I'm going to present to you some of the work that we have been doing with Bruegel, another think tank, which a lot of you will be familiar with, which is trying to look at the geopolitical aspects of the European Green Deal. And our starting point is really that there is a sort of perennial problem with a lot of EU foreign policy, with a lot of EU policy making, which is that the EU will often take on quite ambitious goals and do it in a way which is blind to the impact on people around it, which can sometimes lead to collateral damage, but often also means that there's blowback and that the EU actually doesn't manage to achieve the things that it wants to achieve on these different issues. If you look at the EU digital agenda, a lot of people are very proud about the impact of GDPR and other initiatives, but nobody did very much work in the sort of geopolitical externalities of GDPR when they were designing the policy and rolling it out. And our kind of sense is that if we are serious about the Green Deal, we should think about it looking at the external aspects from the beginning, not least because Europe is only a very small part of global emissions. So if we want the Green Deal to be part of something which is going to actually have a meaningful impact on the solution to the climate emergency, then we need to see it as a global initiative. So this paper, which we did with Bruegel, both tries to map out some of the external dimensions and then ends with a sort of action plan, which is designed both to deal with some of the defensive issues, to make sure that there isn't external blowback to the Green New Deal, which could blow it up as we start to implement it. But more importantly, to see how you could actually externalize a lot of our preferences, because the EU only accounts for 10% of global carbon emissions. So EU action is obviously only going to have a marginal impact on the survival of the planet if it isn't used to catalyze action by others. So I'll start with the sort of general purpose of the paper, which is our kind of assumption that as the Green Deal is designed to redefine our whole economic model, it's obviously going to have an enormous impact on our relationship with other countries that are bound into our economy, starting with the neighborhood country, which Jennifer's already talked about, but also is obviously going to have huge implications for our relationships with other great powers, not least the United States of America and China. So what I'll present to you now is both a sort of attempt to think about some of the different geopolitical channels with which the European Green Deal will impact on others, to look at some of the key countries that will be affected by it, and then to lay out some of these foreign policy actions that we think could be taken as part of an action plan to flank the Green Deal. So if we start with the likely geopolitical implications, what you can see is from these charts is how almost 3/4 of the EU energy system currently relies on fossil fuels. So therefore, we're going to see a kind of massive shift as we move towards 2050 if the EU implements its targets with a particularly big shift after 2030. And after 2030, oil and gas imports are expected to go down by almost 80% for oil and up to 70% in gas compared to 2015. So it will have an enormous impact on countries that are exporting those elements. We have looked at how the EU energy system is going to affect other countries. And there's sort of four main channels that we've been looking at. First of all, looking at the direct impact on oil and gas producing countries in the EU neighborhood. Secondly, thinking about how, if there is an energy transition, it affects our sovereignty or strategic autonomy, because ECFR has worked a lot over the years. Some of the problematic elements of energy dependency on different neighbors. So the question is, are we going to substitute one set of dependencies for others as we move towards renewable energy? Thirdly, we'll look at the sort of indirect implications on other countries that aren't necessarily selling oil and gas to the European Union, but who will be affected by changes in prices in global energy markets. And finally, we're going to look at some of the repercussions around global trade, again, tackling some of the issues that Jennifer mentioned earlier, particularly the carbon border adjustment measures. So if you look at the direct implications for our neighbors, given that the EU is spending, I think, 300 billion euros on carbon fuels, you can see that a lot of our neighboring countries are directly affected, both those who cater for a lot of our markets, but also you can see from this that many countries have the EU as a huge part of their exports. And these are the countries which are oil producers that are going to be affected. And so, as I said, the EU currently spent almost 300 billion euros on oil and gas in 2018. But as it shifts towards more renewable sources, there's a danger of substituting one type of dependency for another. We've had all these long debates about our dependency on Russia and the ability of Russia to blackmail different European countries. I think there has been a kind of transformation in how energy markets work to lessen the sort of geopolitical implications of those dependencies. But as we move towards importing green electricity, green hydrogen, but also as batteries become absolutely central to our mix, there is a danger that we will have a whole series of new dependencies. So this chart looks at both some of the big countries that are going to be who we've been dependent on in the past. We know, as I said, a lot about the dependence on Russia. But as we move towards having these new materials, such as rare earths and others, you can see that there could potentially be a huge dependency on China and on other countries. So the third sort of channel, which we talked about, is looking at how the reduction in European consumption will affect global energy prices. So as well as the countries that sell oil and gas to us directly, if there is a depression of global energy prices, you could see that there are other major suppliers such as the US and Saudi Arabia who could be very negatively affected by the depression of global prices as a result of EU consumption. And the sort of fourth big dimension is, I think, in many ways the most important, because it is one which relates to the great powers, which is the idea of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. There are all sorts of debates going on about how it could be implemented without endangering the multilateral trading system. There are all sorts of reasons why carbon border adjustment measures seem to be very important, not least to prevent carbon leakages and us simply exporting our emissions to other countries, or putting our economic base at a competitive disadvantage to other parts of the world. But the technical aspects of carbon border adjustment mechanisms obviously incredibly difficult, and there are also real dangers of plunging the world into trade wars if we don't tread carefully. In our paper, we had a lot of debates about that, but our kind of preference would be for the EU to find a way of working very closely with the US to try and find a way of implementing carbon border adjustment mechanisms which will not fall foul of WTO rules, and use that to have a parallel discussion with China. I will now move to the foreign policy action plan. As I said, there's sort of two planks for that. The first plank is more defensive plank, looking at how we can deal with some of the direct geopolitical repercussions and make sure that there isn't too much blowback to the European Green Deal. And the second track is about thinking about how we can externalize European ambitions so that our actions act as catalysts for global changes in behavior. So I'll go through those two tracks quickly. The first track I will start with, which is something which Jennifer already talked about in her presentation. She's sort of looking at how we manage the impact of the Green Deal on neighboring oil and gas supporting countries. That means helping energy exporters in the European neighborhood who are going to feel the greatest impact from Europe's carbon transition. Algeria, for example, has few alternative markets for its natural gas. The changes for Algeria are going to be wrenching because hydrocarbon accounts for 95% of Algeria's exports by value, and they pay for 60% of its national budget. But a slow motion collapse of neighboring economies is also very threatening for us. It could breed instability, inspire migration. So it obviously makes sense for us to use our neighborhood policy to help countries diversify their economies, for example, by promoting solar energy, promoting and possibly maybe more speculatively hydrogen markets in some of these countries. The second step is about ensuring that we don't simply substitute one set of dependencies around carbon fuels for another set of dependencies as we move towards more sustainable energy sources. And as I said earlier, as we rely more and more on batteries, the EU is going to have to decrease its new dependence on critical raw materials, particularly rare earths from China. And that means both finding new suppliers, but also finding ways of recycling products. The third step is about managing the geopolitical implications of the carbon adjustment mechanism. I spoke a bit earlier about the reasons why a mechanism is so essential, and I think in many ways it's a very exciting expression of European, of potential European power to introduce a mechanism. I know that there are big debates about it, but I've always found the idea both intellectually very persuasive, but also I think it's an interesting instance of the Brussels effect potentially taking place and allowing the EU to actually have an outsized role on the world stage. But we do need to, so in our paper, we look at some of the technical issues. I have to confess that these discussions were more informed by Bruegel than they were by the ECFR researchers on that project. But they looked at a lot of the ways of working through the WTO and the Paris frameworks to minimize the risks of pushback within the WTO. And our kind of sense is that the adoption by the US and the EU of similar mechanisms would effectively create a climate club that other countries such as China might one day aspire to join if they meet environmental standards. And if you can leverage the combined US and EU economies to spread the environmental values of the Green Deal, that will obviously be a huge win in terms of the shape of the global economy, but it could also be a way of binding in less climate-friendly future US administrations, which is always going to be a risk to any of these measures, as we've seen in the last few years. So that's the sort of first track, which is the more defensive mechanisms. What of the other track, which is of tooling the EU up to be a foreign policy leader?
Mark, sorry for interrupting. Can I give you a 1 minute warning?
Sure.
Okay, good.
So in 1 minute, there's also a kind of positive agenda of looking at how we can leverage the European market and the Green Deal to become a global reference and standard setter, which is something which Jennifer already talked about. And in fact, a lot of the different measures in that can be through setting standards for the hydrogen market, for green bonds, which Jennifer's already talked about. And we can also finally look at how you can export the Green Deal through the MFF and making a lot of European money available. We recommend that 10% of the next generation budget should be devoted to climate action, which would leverage about 60 billion euros for exporting the European Green Deal to neighboring countries. And finally, there is a sort of set of ideas about building new global coalitions for climate change, and we focused specifically at two areas: permafrost and also looking at how we can have a global coalition for removing CO2 emissions and using EU trade, development, and financial policy to pursue that agenda. So I'm happy to go into more details in the questions, and we will also make the full paper available to anyone who is interested in going into greater detail. Thank you.
Great. Thank you also, Mark. This has been an extremely rich presentation by our three experts. And now we want to bring you in as our participants in the Q&A session. And I will use the privilege of the chair to give the floor first to my colleague, Sergei Lagodinsky, to ask his questions or make his contribution. And then I will pick up from the chat and I will pose as many questions as we can to our experts and then give them the opportunity to respond. And at the end, we will have concluding remarks. Sergei, you're next.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thanks to the guests. It's great to be in such a round of experts. A very brief question dealing with Russia, but especially with Turkey, I wanted to refer to what Mark mentioned regarding the neighborhood. With Turkey, we have especially a situation we have an energy center, an energy hub, a country which is our very important trade partner, and we are an important trade partner for them. Thus, the carbon adjusting tax is an important issue there. And of course, we have a geopolitical factor where in the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, we are talking about the old energy instead of talking the new one. The question that I have is, in how far can we work, or should we work, regarding extending the Green Deal agenda vis-a-vis Turkey as kind of an offer to engage them also geopolitically in a new era, instead of being stuck in the era of the 19th century fuels. And I think that this opens also another question, maybe you could shed light on that, is of course most of those cooperations are delicate, because energy and climate, of course, is not the only issue that we're having with those countries. How do we balance the issue of those cooperations versus other values that we represent? Because in this particular case, this is of course an important question. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to further discussion.
Thank you, Sergey. And now I will pick up questions from the chat, and I would ask our experts to take note of the questions and to select later which questions they want to address. I will give each and every one of them about 5 minutes at the end to respond. So the first question that I see is from Andrei Kornichuk from the Heinrich Böll Foundation. It reads, how do you see the potential to use actively climate change as a tool in the EU's peace-building toolkit in certain regions, that is bringing together sides of armed conflict in certain situations and regions around critical environmental issues like access to clean water? Then there is a question from Lisa Tostado. I would be interested in hearing your reflections on other border adjustments, not just carbon, i.e. pesticide use or any other issues related to process and not product standards. Ties back to the tough shaping global trade fora discussion, WTO reform. Then there is a question from Jan van Herf. Will a strong focus on CO2 in energy and climate diplomacy through means like CBAMs lead to a renaissance of nuclear energy in third partner countries? How should the EU engage on this in practical terms? Then there's a question from Sven Harmeling from Climate Action Network Europe. He writes on the CBAM to Mark Leonard, while of course eyeing the big emitting countries receives particular attention, it would be important to also consider and minimize impacts on particularly progressive LDCs or island states to the extent they are affected. Which measures do you see the EU can take to also assist LDCs LDCs as least developed countries in coping with ambitious environmental regulations in the context of them implementing ambitious national determined contributions? Then Jan van Herf again writes, John Kerry just cautioned hopes of EU pressing ahead on CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism. Similar, new OECD SecGen, the Australian, has cast doubts. Is the risk of geopolitical tensions really decreasing, especially given the advanced timelines of the EU for proposals? Then from Rosemary Kuppers, lack of water is a serious hazard to mankind. Now it is being traded by international stock markets and in the hands of private shareholders. How to deal with this? Mark Leonard sent a link to the ECFR Bruegel paper. Then there's a question from Marcus Stadthaus. What is your view of the institutional setup of the EU on climate, energy, Green Deal diplomacy, and climate and security? Do we need a European John Kerry? Michael Schmidt writes, in your analysis, how far is the EIB, the European Investment Bank, as largest public bank on the planet, in aligning with the Green Deal? From Robert Sperfeld, what would be a wise division of labor between EU member states and the EU for the climate and Green Deal diplomacy? Quite a wealth of questions, and I would ask our experts to now take 5 minutes each to answer select questions. I hope we will be able to cover them all, and I will go by inverse order and ask you first, Mark.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And I overshot last time, so I'll try and make sure that I stay within my time this time. But I think Sergei's point about Turkey is very well made and very interesting. And I would have thought that what we need to do is to come up, I think this is a moment where the Turkey relationship needs to be reinvented. We already started moving away from the accession track with the refugee deal, which was a kind of response to a kind of short-term crisis. But I'd have thought that as we look forward, these sorts of issues are going to be enormously important, given how much Turkey has put itself in a position of being an energy hub at the future. So I think that's a brilliant idea, and I think is something which is very powerful, and I think could, if we get it right, provide a template for how we deal with a lot of the other neighboring countries that I mentioned beforehand that are going to be really aggressively affected by the Green Deal, and where we need to have quite a forward-leaning approach, because if not, we could see a huge amount of unhappiness and instability on our borders. As you say, it's going to be very difficult with all these countries to balance our different objectives. But I think that climate is going to become a bigger and bigger part of the mix of issues as we relate to them. But I think the nature of our diplomatic links now is very rarely going to be one-dimensional, because there's so few like-minded countries with whom we're dealing on these issues. So we are going to have to find ways of chewing and eating gum on them. Lots of really good questions around the border adjustment. I think too many to answer in the few seconds that I have left, but I think that's why we think that it's so important not just to see this as a technical discussion, because it is going to have enormously important implications, both for these sort of great power relations, how we deal with China and the US, but as Jennifer's chart showed, we need to think through what it means for countries like Ukraine in our neighborhood that we're trying to support in other ways. And then your points about the LDCs is obviously, and vulnerable states is obviously absolutely central as well. One of the reasons why we suggested putting aside 10% of the Next Generation Europe funding for development projects is so that we can actually have resources to do that. Though, obviously money is only a small part of the solution. You have all the other dimensions which we have been talking about, from capacity building to work on technology to all the regulatory and other tools that we were talking about. I'll probably stop there.
Thank you, Mark. And I now turn to Michel Gadimaka, please.
Thank you. I think many questions were not directly addressed to me, but I have an opinion on some of them at least. And I maybe
go ahead.
I also take some of the statements of Mark into account. That is on to start with, on raw materials. We did a lot of studies on that one. And what we of course see is that circular economy is really an important instrument. I sometimes cynically tell audiences it's the poor man's solution on the one hand, because if you don't have your materials available, and you need to get them from Russia or China or other places, then until you don't have a substitute here, you're, well, basically bound to them. But what I found interesting is that in September last year, the EU brought out a critical raw materials list, including some appendices where they also stated where battery materials in Europe could be found and mined. And of course, that's last 20 years or so been a not in my backyard position. But I think if we want to be more independent from China, for example, from critical raw materials, especially rare earth, and at the same time be able to pursue some more green technologies, then we have to consider mining in Europe again, I guess. The Russia gas dependency, unfortunately, is here to stay for another 30 years, I'm afraid. And then a third one, I guess, is the adaptive capacity of countries outside of the EU. Question mark is, to what extent are these countries indeed able to adapt to climate change? And I think there's a huge task and also an opportunity, also a business-wise opportunity for EU to step in and help out. So yeah, I would leave it here. Thanks.
Thank you. Before I give you the floor, Jennifer, I would read an additional question that has just come in, and would like to ask you to address that also if you can. It's from Lisa Tostado, and it says, the European Green Deal does not contain a single reference to gender, even though the gender dimension of the green transition as well as climate change are well known. What about gender in the external dimension we have been discussing? How can the EU deal with the danger of a global backlash on gender equality in the face of pandemic and the need for a green recovery? And as your two colleagues have been so kind to be very short, you can maybe spend an additional minute on that. Please.
Thank you very much. Lisa, I really wish you'd asked that question beforehand so my male panelists and my male co-panelists could have answered as well, because I would have loved to hear their views on this. I do think it's a really important dimension. I particularly think it's a really important dimension for climate security and climate risk concerns, because we know that frequently women bear the brunt of climate risk, of kind of managing after the disaster has hit, are frequently more exposed to some of the disasters, depending on kind of the fragility of their societies and the roles that they take in them. So I do think it's incredibly important. And I think as we start thinking through the external dimensions of the deal, not bringing gender into the equation would be a mistake. But that can't just be in the external dimension, because it's also happening in climate impacted communities here in Europe. So I think this is maybe one where the external can bring stuff back in to our Green Deal. But yes, I would very much invite other panelists to maybe put their comments into the chat on this. Now, I'm really happy to see the rich amount of questions. So I'm going to try to cover a couple of them. I think on Egypt, it is incredibly important to engage them. The one thing that I would caution is to not attempt to export the European Green Deal wholesale. The whole point of the Green Deal is that it's not just an economic strategy, it's a social contract to a certain extent. And you can't export a social contract into an external context. You need to co-develop on the basis of some of the rules that you found really useful and share the policy experiences, but it needs to be owned by that country. It needs to be developed by that country. And I think if we just try to lazily kind of export policies, that's where we're going to get a ton of diplomatic pushback in the way that I think Mark's report also really shows we have in the past. So I caution us not to take the lazy approach here, but embrace the nuance and the co-development, bringing our experiences to the table, but not wholesale exporting. When it comes to CBAM, I do think that it is worth talking with partners about this. My main concern is that it's currently being driven as a bureaucratic rather than a political, let alone diplomatic process. And that is the real danger. That's where we're going to get the pushback. So I think really looking at where do member states, where do diplomats, how can we engage around this before the proposal comes out and after the proposal is there? I also think one of the things that I haven't heard is conversations about where the share of proceeds will go, like where will actually the proceeds go, and is part of it meant to support energy transitions in partner countries? Is some of it meant to support external dimensions of this as well? If we pour this into own resources, does that support the diplomatic acceptability of this instrument? Within E3G, we are still very much in favor of product standards wherever possible, because we just think it's the more collaborative and the more sustainable long-term solution. But we will see. I think for a first bit, really treating this as a political and diplomatic process, not just an internal kind of bureaucratic one, is really key and is really not happening, at least from what I'm seeing. On the EIB, is it perfect? Probably not. Is it world leading? Yeah, kind of. We have a whole team working on multilateral development banks and public banks within E3G, and they are very, very impressed with the EIB, and particularly its energy lending policy. And actually, this is one of the reasons why the taxonomy discussions are so important, because you risk the EIB energy lending policy being more ambitious than the taxonomy if you see gas kind of labeled as a green or sustainable piece under it. But the EIB is really a diplomatic asset when it comes to EU diplomacy internationally on climate, because they are really adopting a climate roadmap. They seem to be putting measures behind it. The next step for Europe internally is actually all of those domestic public banks who are not as world leading as the EIB is, and that's a harder nut to crack, shall we say, but it is one that I think is really key to delivering the European Green Deal at home as well as abroad. When it comes to the institutional setup, it hasn't grown with the importance of the topic. I think that is the diplomatic way of putting it. I mean, it's frequently a handful of people trying to somehow mainstream all of this through the Commission architecture. I also think there's still very limited link up between the funding and the diplomacy on this. So the simple fact that like the neighborhood development and international cooperation mechanism sits in DG Interper, a lot of the diplomacy is meant to be being driven through DG Klima, through the EAS. That doesn't seem to be linking up. I think there are some real risks here as the topic grows for our own importance, but our capacities and our infrastructure doesn't. I do think EU member state and kind of Brussels alignment on this has really improved, and there are some formal and informal networks that are supporting that, but a lot more could be done. And I think this is really where it comes to, if you're actually going to go beyond risk managing the external dimensions of the Green Deal to actually profiting from it and leveraging it abroad, you need to have proactive intra-EU diplomacy to bring member states on board, because only if you have aligned messages, aligned outreach from member states and the Brussels architecture can you actually do that. Only then will we be credible. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done fairly quickly, but I also think there are a lot of opportunities as things like alignment around the Italian G20 or alignment around the German G7 shows. And then two final points, which are actually more reacting to something that fellow panelists have said. One, I was very excited by Mr. Gadimaka's presentation. I think the thing that really stood out to me is how climate vulnerable China is. Now, I have been saying this for a while, but it's really nice to see data to support that, because I frequently get the question, why should China care about this? Or why should X and Y country care about this? And I think indexes like these show why. It is not frequently in the political debate. It is not even frequently in the political debate in a country like China, but it is there, and engaging on that, even if it's in closed rooms, is really important. And then a final piece, I completely agree with Mark that climate earmarking is going to be really important for programming and funding on this of external dimensions of the Green Deal, but we also need to apply the do no significant harm principle. It's not enough to have a pot for climate. It's important that we're not spending stuff on things that make our life harder, investing in the wrong things, investing in supporting partners down a pathway that jeopardizes all of our climate safety. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, also. We're now coming to a close. We have packed a lot of extremely rich content into a very short time. We've had a whirlwind of ideas. And the one thing that sticks out for me is captured in a sentence that Mark formulated, that the European Green Deal can't succeed without its external dimensions succeeding also. I don't think that this is necessarily a widely shared perspective yet, so that's a real task. And I now want to thank our experts for their extremely valuable contributions and want to give the floor to my colleagues Viola von Kramon and Hannah Neumann, 2.5 minutes each to make their concluding remarks. For MEPs, that's a lot of time. So Viola, you go first, please.
Well, thanks a lot, Reinhard, for organizing, facilitating this very, very valuable workshop. To be honest, I have learned a lot for the last 70, 80 minutes. I was really impressed by all of our 3 guest speakers, by the presentations and the information they have given. But then I was trying to reflect what actually we do as Greens in the European Parliament. And we, of course, are, let's say, the cornerstones for making sure that this external dimension exists within the European Green Deal. And then maybe looking at our work in our countries where we do have responsibility, or in the shadow negotiations where we try to reach these targets of 55% in the EPA-free funds, in the other funds. I think that's always up to us Greens to really set this right incentives. And so I can follow most of what was or have been said by our guests, and I can only maybe give some of my, let's say, reflections or impressions from talking to some of the key also countries which were mentioned in some of the charts by Mark and by Jennifer. So, for example, speaking yesterday to one of the major energy supplier from Ukraine, who tried and who began very early already to invest in renewables, they would be happy if we could push our European Green Deal with the external dimension already now much harder towards outside of our borders. So for them, it would be beneficial. And they said, if you set the right incentives and if you make sure there is like a Übergangszeitraum, like a transition period for us to adapt, it would support the right forces, the right powers, the right people. It would make a difference also in terms of anti-corruption, in terms of anti-oligarchization in those countries. So when we speak about transition, energy transition, this has a third dimension. This has also an anti-corruption. It was already 4 minutes. Okay. Well, I just would like to say, in the neighborhood, in the Western Balkan, in Eastern Partnership, and there where we have responsibilities, our partners would like to see us to be a driving force in terms of a very ambitious Green Deal agenda. And that's what I think we Greens do. And therefore, I can only reassure we are absolutely in line with this global diplomacy in terms of European Green Deal. And we try to set up new institutions and hopefully we'll get some more support from the European Commission, the European Council and the ESS. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Viola. Hannah, the same 2.5 minutes for you.
The same 2.5, so I have 3. That's perfect. Thanks, Reinhard. Well, I mean, with the Green Deal, the European Union, I think, has put forward a very ambitious pathway towards climate neutrality domestically. But it's clear with the EU only being, I mean, in charge of about 10% of the CO2 emissions. First of all, we cannot save the planet alone, so we will need alliances. But also even our domestic pathway towards climate neutrality is going to have repercussions on the foreign policy. And I think all 3 presentations have been brilliant to explain to us what those may be. And I'm just now, because I think it's mainly our green challenge to see how do we use the Green Deal, how do we translate it to foreign policy, but also how can we use this agreement to make foreign policy actually a driver for a global Green Deal. I have taken 3 aspects from your presentation. The first one is continue to support mitigation strategies. And I think here Michael was quite clear in where our partners would be and where also we should focus our interests. Then check our own foreign policy in terms of consistency. So what is in our trade deals, for example, that contradicts the ambitions that we have with the Green Deal? What is in our investment policy? What is in our defense policies? to check them for consistency, but also for possible repercussions. And I think here, especially Mark's presentation was very good, and the whole discussion around the carbon border adjustment tax will also fall into this one. And then the last one, and here I actually think see the most potential, and I find it most interesting for us, is the question, how can we use our foreign policy and the many tools that we have to build strong alliances with other countries, but also with companies, with movements, with civil society organizations to really push towards a global Green Deal, energy transition, climate Paris agreement in the full implementation, in the interconnectedness of the implementation. And here, I mean, I really found, Jennifer, your input very thought-provoking also, because it had this specific focus on what the EU could do. And all of this has given us much food for thought, a lot of ideas on how we can also make the EU a global actor into this one, maybe even a leading one, but also really showed how much policy building work and action there is still to do. Nevertheless, I'm very happy that we had this also very brave and honest discussion, because in the end, I think no one is better placed than us Greens to push for this one. First of all, because I mean, climate is our core expertise. Second, because we have global partners in so many countries. Now, the Greens are, for example, part of the New Zealand government, and because it is our core capacity in how we do politics to build exactly this kind of alliances. So thank you very much for pushing us a bit further towards this edge. And just be assured we will walk with full speed in this direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah. 3 very short final remarks from me. Number 1, thank you. Thank you to our experts. Thank you to our interpreters, to my team that has organized this, to my colleagues that you've just heard, and to all the participants. Second, we obviously need to continue the conversation. Contributions in the chat are still coming in, so we will find ways for doing that. And third, after this webinar, you're warmly invited to join Scott Keller, the co-president of the Greens in the European Parliament, and Sven Giegold, the Speaker of the German Greens in the European Parliament, for closing remarks. You can follow the stream live at 11 CET on YouTube in English and German, and you find the link in the chat. Thank you all very much. This has been extremely exciting. Have a good day and stay negative.